Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com. And yes, it has finally arrived. Schubert, Symphonies 8 and 9 with Jordi Savall and Le Concert des Nations on Alia Vox. And the burning question, is this better than the absolutely wretched, horrible, abominable René Jacob version of the same repertoire? The short answer is yes. It is enormously better. I mean 100,000% better. But is it a great Schubert 8 and 9? Well, not yet. Not exactly. It's tolerable. Let me put it to you that way. I mean, you may want better than tolerable in your performances of great music. I don't know. I tend to want fabulous, not just tolerable. But this has its beautiful moments. It really does. It makes the case for a period instrument approach to a degree. So let's just go through it and explain exactly what I mean. Start with the unfinished. The first movement of the unfinished is really lovely. It works quite well. I mean, what I mean is the balances are right. The tunes are where they're supposed to be. The climax is climax. It's not some demented abortion of a performance as Jacob was. On the plus side, the strings actually sound quite lovely. Why? Because there are enough of them. There are 11 firsts and second violins, basically, a bunch of violas, 6 cellos, 4 basses. I mean, it's a normal-sized orchestra so that everything falls into place, more or less the way it's supposed to. There are some deficits. The woodwind playing is not fabulous. It's somewhat faceless and uninteresting, I think. The horns and the trombones and the trumpets could balance a little bit better. Savall is a decent conductor. He gets the piece, so I'm not too worried about that. The second movement, the Andante con moto, like Jacob, has much more con moto than Andante. I mean, it's really fast. It's 9 minutes and a bit. But it doesn't sound as slow. One of the reasons is that the whole thing is recorded in a rather flattering acoustic. There's a certain amount of reverberation. The strings don't sound so emaciated. Whether they're using vibrato or a lot of vibrato or no vibrato, it's sort of hard to tell. But what you do notice is that they sound good. So who cares? I mean, they sound pretty decent. They're a little bit undernourished, but not horribly so. And at the tempo, it works. I prefer a little bit more majesty in the speed. I think that the piece needs to have a little more balance between the movements. Usually, they take almost exactly the same time, like 12 minutes and 12 minutes. Well, here, it's 13 minutes and 9 minutes. But that's legitimate. I mean, that's acceptable, and it's okay. It's a pretty performance. I had very few issues with it, so that's good. Now, the ninth, the great C major. Oh, that's always a problem. I mean, it's one of the most problematic pieces in the repertoire, no matter what. And to Savall's credit, I will say, he's not completely dogmatic about the piece. I mean, you have to remember, when it comes to both of these works, Schubert never lived to hear either of them. They were never published. He never had a chance to revise them. He revised some of them. He revised the bits of the ninth, we'll talk about in a second, actually unheard. In the process of composition, he made some choices. And Savall, he sort of gets it. I mean, not as well as other major conductors who are willing to tinker more productively. But for example, I'll give you an example. The very end of the first movement, when the big tune from the very opening, da, 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 dum, ba, bum, comes back, the tune of the introduction, well, it's inaudible the way Schubert scored it, which was only for woodwinds. Almost everybody adds some reinforcement there, whether it's horns or horns and trumpets. They do something. There are two alternatives. One is to reinforce the tune. The other is to restore Schubert's original string parts, because we know what they were. The strings are going chunk, 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 chunk. They either cover the woodwinds or they don't. Tovey mentioned that, and he even wrote in his little analysis of the work, what the difference was, where you could hear the woodwinds come through or not. So most people leave it the way Schubert wrote it and reinforce. He reinforces. He lets the horns have the tune. Good move. A very smart move. On the other hand, the playing is sometimes a little bit unsteady. These performances are live, and they're the product of a couple Schubert academies with some young musicians and whatnot. I don't know what they were doing, but the bottom line is, this is not one of the world's great ensembles. And aside from that sort of faceless woodwind playing, like the oboe in the second movement, not special. The strings are a little scruffy at times. They don't. The nice reverberant acoustic helps them. Let's put it that way. But the rhythms are sometimes a little unsteady, and Savall himself is subject to a little bit of sort of randomness. For example, the opening allegro gets launched at a really nice, buoyant tempo. But he takes the repeat in the first movement, the exposition repeat, and it seems to have slowed down the second time around. That's my subjective impression. And there are little things like that. Now, the second movement, like I said, has an oboe solo, which is not as thrilling as the oboe solo should be. And it's also quite zippy at about 13 minutes, but it's a march, and it's okay. It's buoyant, and it sounds all right. The scherzo, it's always a problem. Why, oh why, does he insist on taking every bloody repeat, even the unmarked second half repeats? Normally, everybody sort of accepts that normally in a minuet or scherzo movement, you take all the repeats in the A section, then you do the trio, which can have all the repeats, which this does, and then you do the second half, the return of the scherzo, without the repeats. And that's perfectly legitimate and authentic and original and all of those things, because just as often a composer will write, scherzo da capo senza replica. Do it again without the repeats. If there was ever a case to do it without the repeats, this is it. Well, he takes all the repeats all over again. That makes the movement 16 minutes. It's the longest movement in the entire symphony. That is wrong. I don't give a damn what argument you advance. To have the scherzo being the longest movement, which consists entirely of rote repetition, is incorrect. It's got to be shorter. It just gets tedious, no matter how quickly or lively or beautifully you play it. And they do play it in a smart, lively way. It's just too much of a good thing. And all of those repeats in the second half, I was just sitting there thinking, oh God, I'm going to be trapped here forever. That's the impression it gives. And it should never give that impression. The piece should never give the impression that it's going on too long or that it's simply repeating itself mechanically. That's just not smart. It was not a smart move on Savall's part. And in addition, again, some of the string playing is a little bit iffy here and there. So, it's not the most tight and exciting performance of it either. And so you add that to the endless repetitions and you get foolishness, just foolishness. Now the finale. The finale starts off really well. Again, it has its repeat intact, which is okay. And the ending, we get to the coda. I like a lot of the things he does. The development section when it's going wah, 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 it has the right feel. The playing has plenty of enthusiasm and excitement. It's a good performance. It's solid. All of the ideas and balances and things are more or less in place. The brass sometimes get a little carried away and drown out the woodwind section. You really ought to do it with double woodwinds as well. Again, Schubert never lived to see this thing in publication. I have no doubt that if he'd had an opportunity to hear it, actually hear it, he would have written senza replica in the scherzo, and who knows, he could have recommended using some extra woodwinds. It needs more to balance itself out, especially when you've got 2 horns, 2 trumpets, and 3 trombones overwhelming your woodwind section and the loud bits, and at the very end in the coda. Okay, so there's a lot of very crisp, let's period instrument articulation, short notes. When those huge pounding C's in the coda, bwomp, 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 womp, ba-da-da-bum, ba-da-da-bum, but, he takes them very clipped. Happily, the acoustic works against him, and they have a little resonance and reverberation, which gives them some power. good idea. In a dry acoustic, it would have sounded horrible, frankly. But of course, there's what do you do with that last chord? Do you do the diminuendo? He does. Oh, the dumbest, most anti-musical, ridiculous thing you could possibly do. Why does he do it? Why does anyone do it? He really whips up that coda. It's exciting. It's going to this thrilling conclusion, this triumphant final note. And it goes blah. And he takes it very short in addition because he's not sure whether to really make the diminuendo or whether to hang on to it. It's stupid. It's just stupid. It's so tiresome to see these people do these things. They're just some things you have to be dogmatic about because there's just no question. This symphony is headed for a triumphant conclusion, period. And if you can't hear that, if you don't hear that, if you think that there's some sort of bizarre, authentic, or texty logic in playing the ending and undermining that final chord because Schubert had syphilis and because he was dying and because it's some sort of anticlimax or, the defeat of the anti-hero, or you have some demented programmatic hallucination going on in your brain, then you have no business playing the work. You just don't, as far as I'm concerned. So, at the end of the day, after all that work and Sturm und Drang, he has no business playing this symphony. He doesn't. He doesn't get it. He gets a lot of it, but at the very end, he doesn't get it, and that's a shame. So, what have we got here? We have a much better than René Jacob Schubert 8 and 9. Is it by itself a great Schubert 8 and 9? Does it compare with all the other great Schubert 8 and 9s that are out there in the discographic universe? No, it simply doesn't. It's not competitive. It's okay for what it is. And you can simply do better. That's just the reality of the discography today. You may be curious about hearing it on period instruments. You may be curious about what Savall does, because he's a very fine musician and what these people do. And I enjoyed hearing it once. I did, I have to confess, until the last note of the ninth. And that scherzo. I enjoyed hearing it once, but I would never keep it. I wouldn't spend money. I wouldn't take it out and play it multiple times. It does not deserve to exist as a permanent document of a great interpretation of this music. It's just another version of what happened on the day with a pickup period band doing its thing. Now, this is volume 1 of the Schubertiad, so get ready. Savall is creeping into the late classical period, having done a completely mediocre and uninteresting Beethoven cycle. So I guess we're going to have it whether we want it or not, and we will discuss it in due course. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.